So let's take a look at this effects dependencies extra credit here. So with this one, it's here optimizing our useEffect. So the way that useEffect works is it will rerun this function every single time our component renders. But our component can render for more reasons than just this namestate updating. For example, it could re-render because the parent re-rendered. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to add a count and a set count right here. We'll initialize that to 0. We'll take this greeting and put it side by side with a button. And here we'll just render the count inside of that button. And on click, we'll pass out a function that calls setCount. And that takes the previous count and says previous count plus 1. Okay, cool. So now every single time I click this button, it's just going to increment. But you'll notice if we add a console log here, rendering greeting, every single time I click on this, we're going to get rendering greeting. And in addition to that, if I add a console log here calling useEffect, then we get rendering greeting and calling useEffect every single time I click on that button. But our name value didn't change. It's the same as it was before. There's no reason to update local storage. So why are we calling useEffect if we don't actually care about updating that name? Well, it really isn't that huge of a deal. It's not going to impact our performance a lot. But sometimes it might. And in addition, the other thing that I want to point out here is that this actually isn't going to cause any bugs. Synchronizing the state of the world with the state of our application, even when that state of the application didn't change, isn't going to trigger any sort of problems or bugs for you, which is why this is the default behavior. But it's suboptimal, so let's go ahead and optimize this. useEffect, because of this very reason, accepts a second argument, which is called a dependency list or an array of dependencies. And here we just list out all of the dependencies for our useEffect. So we say, hey, the state of the world is going to fall out of sync with the state of my application based on these states. So just the name. If the name changes, then the state of the world is out of sync with the state of my app. And so I need to rerun that callback to synchronize the state of the world with the state of my app. And so that's all that it takes. We add that name as a dependency, and now every time I click on this button, we're going to get re-rendering greeting, which is what you'd expect, but we're not going to call our useEffect. We're only going to call it when we type in here. And there we go. Every single keystroke, we're calling that useEffect because the state of the world fell out of sync with the state of our app, and so we need to synchronize those two things, and that's what useEffect is really good at. One thing to keep in mind here is that this dependency list can be of any length. So regardless of how many things that you're actually using inside of this useEffect, you can just include all of those things. And another thing to keep in mind is you want to make sure that you include all of the things that you're using that can change over time in your dependency array here. And we're getting a yellow underline. That's because I have an ESLint rule here installed in the project that says, hey, make sure that you include all your dependencies. But let's see what happens if I don't include the dependency and just say, hey, this has no dependencies. So as I type in here, you'll notice that my useEffect isn't getting called, but my local storage value is also not getting updated, which is making me, the user, lose work over time. So you want to make sure that you don't skip out on the dependencies that you're passing to this dependency array. And the cool thing about this is if you have the ESLint editor plugin installed, then you can actually auto fix this, and Dan Abramoff will just come and add that dependency list for you. Thank you, Dan. So that will just be auto-filled for you. You don't need to really worry about managing that. Another thing to keep in mind here is that React does a shallow comparison for all of these dependencies. And so if you have two objects between renders, an object A and then object B, even if those have all of the same properties, you're going to get a rerun of your useEffect because it does this shallow comparison, because the object before is not the same as the current object, even if they look exactly the same. So putting some sort of actual object in here, we're going to get an ESLint warning for that. Is basically because it's a complex expression and the ESLint plugin doesn't understand it. But this is going to trigger a useEffect for every single time we get a re-render, which is not exactly our goal here. And there are things that you can do to optimize away from that, but that's just something to keep in mind, that the values that you pass in here are compared basically as if you were to do a triple equals or object.is, which is what React is using internally. So in review, what we did here was we noticed that this use effect is getting called on every single re-render, even if the name didn't change. And so to optimize away from this and only rerun our use effect when the name does change, we added it to the dependency array here so that we can say, hey, React, I don't care about re-renders or anything like that. All I care about is if the name changes, then that means the side effect that I'm trying to synchronize has fallen out of sync, and I need to make an update to the state of the world to match that change in my application.